Okinawa, May 1945. Imagine standing at the top of a cliff over 100 meters high, sinking into slippery mud and surrounded by a thick fog that smells of sulfur and blood. The sky is literally raining fire. Artillery shrapnel cuts through the air like invisible razors, and an enemy army advances relentlessly toward you, crawling out of holes in the earth like vengeful ghosts. The order echoing over the radio is clear, broadcast in pure panic. Retreat, everyone fall back immediately. The American soldiers, exhausted and terrified, run desperately for the cargo nets, throwing themselves over the edge of the cliff to save their own lives, abandoning a position that had become a slaughterhouse. But in the midst of this absolute chaos, the black smoke and the screams of agony, one single man does not run away. He runs in the opposite direction, straight into the heart of the crossfire. He is completely alone, and the most terrifying detail of this entire scene is that he is carrying absolutely no weapons, no knife, no pistol, no rifle, nothing. How did a completely unarmed man survive the bloodiest and most ruthless battlefield of the entire Second World War and become one of the greatest heroes in American military history? The answer to this question defies logic, science, and everything you think you know about war and the human survival instinct. If you want to discover the secret behind this impossible miracle, hold on to your seat and do not blink. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now, because what you are going to hear in the next few minutes will permanently alter your view of what a human being is capable of when driven by an unbreakable conviction. To understand the miracle that happened on that mountain in Okinawa, we need to go back in time and cross the world. Forget for a moment the heroic soldier immortalized in monuments. Look at a skinny, quiet, and reflective boy walking the dirt roads of the small town of Lynchburg, Virginia. Desmond Doss was born in 1919 in a world still trying to heal the open wounds left by the First World War. And for little Desmond, the deepest and most painful scar of that World War was not in history books, but inside his own home. Desmond's father, Thomas Doss, was a carpenter and a World War I veteran. He had survived the horrors of Europe and returned with his body intact, but with his mind and soul shattered by what medicine today calls post-traumatic stress disorder. At that time, there was no therapy or understanding for veterans. To deal with the demons of the trenches, the memories of dead friends, and the constant pain, Thomas turned to alcohol. The Doss family home lived in a state of constant tension and fear. It was a true powder keg ready to explode at any moment, marked by outbursts of rage and domestic violence. But Desmond found refuge, silence, and peace in religion. His mother, Bertha, was a devout Seventh-day Adventist. She filled the walls of their humble home with religious pictures and biblical teachings. One picture in particular, hanging in the hallway, hypnotized young Desmond every day. It was an illustration of the Ten Commandments. Next to the sixth commandment, which read, "Thou shalt not kill," there was a drawing of Cain holding a club over the lifeless body of his brother Abel. Desmond would spend hours in silence just staring at that image. He wondered with childish sorrow how in the world a brother could do such a cruel thing to another. That drawing was not just paper and ink hanging on the wall. It penetrated the boy's mind and became the unbreakable source code of Desmond's soul. Desmond's pacifist conviction, however, was tested and forged in fire long before the war. During a childhood game that got out of hand, he got into a nasty fight with his older brother, Hal. In the heat of the moment, Desmond picked up a heavy brick and threw it at his brother's head. Hal fell to the ground, unconscious and bleeding profusely. The absolute dread of having killed his own brother, the terror of having become the very Cain from that illustration he stared at so often, carved an irrevocable promise into his chest. While crying and watching his brother recover, Desmond swore to himself and to God that he would never, under any circumstances, take a life. That promise was sealed with iron and fire years later, during his youth, on a terrible night when his father, completely drunk and blind with rage, pulled out a loaded firearm during a violent argument with his brother-in-law. Tragedy was imminent. Desmond's mother intervened bravely, managed to take the gun from her husband's hands, and handed it to her son, telling him to run and hide it. With the cold, heavy revolver in his trembling hands, hiding in the dark, Desmond made a second silent oath. That would be the last time in his entire life he would ever touch a firearm. And then the calendar turned to December 7th, 1941. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor ripped through the Hawaiian sky and dragged the United States into the greatest conflict in human history. The world was collapsing. Young men from all over the country formed miles-long lines at recruiting centers, eager to defend the nation. Desmond, at the time, was working at a naval shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. But because building ships was considered an essential profession for the war effort, he had the legal right to receive a military deferment. He didn't have to go. He could have stayed home, safe, earning a good salary and building a life with his fiancée, Dorothy Shute. But as the boys from his town and his church went off to Europe and the Pacific, many returning in coffins, Desmond felt an unbearable calling. He felt it was not fair to sit in the comfort of his living room while other men bled and died to protect his family's freedom. He went to the recruiting center and volunteered, but he did so imposing a condition that sounded like a sick joke to the United States Army. He enlisted as a conscientious objector, or, as he preferred to be called, a conscientious cooperator. Desmond stood before the recruiting officers and said with a calm but firm voice that he wanted to serve on the front lines, in the most dangerous place possible, but while everyone else would be there to take lives, he would be there solely to save them. He demanded to be a combat medic, but refused to carry any weapon to defend himself. The Army, at first, laughed. To the military machine of 1942, the concept of an unarmed combat medic did not exist. The military machine is not designed to accommodate individual morality or extreme religious convictions. It is built for lethal uniformity and blind obedience. Upon being sent to infantry training camps at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, Desmond's personal hell began. When the other recruits in his platoon discovered that this skinny, smiling man refused to touch a rifle and that he demanded a free pass to avoid work on Saturdays because of his religious Sabbath, he was not seen as a man of principles. He was seen as a threat, a parasite, a pathetic coward who, the moment real bullets started flying, would put the entire platoon's lives at risk. The psychological and physical abuse that followed was brutal and relentless. His superiors tried absolutely everything to break his will and force him to request a discharge. They made Desmond scrub the latrines over and over. He was publicly humiliated in front of the gathered troops. At night, in the dark of the barracks, heavy boots would fly toward him, striking his face. Insults, threats, and physical assaults were his daily routine. He took the beatings in silence, wiped his blood from his face, and then knelt by his bed to pray for the very men who were attacking him. The battalion command tried to declare him mentally unstable, attempting to slap him with a Section 8 discharge for insanity, but psychiatric evaluations proved Desmond was perfectly lucid and highly intelligent. They threatened him repeatedly with a court-martial for direct disobedience to a superior's orders for refusing to hold a rifle at the shooting range. But Desmond did not back down 1 single millimeter. Military and bureaucratic fury violently collided against an unshakable spiritual mountain. After extensive internal legal battles and even petitions that reached the highest levels of government in Washington, the Army was forced to swallow the American Constitution. Desmond had the legal right to go to war unarmed. He would go with the infantry division, but armed only with his bandages and his Bible. On the night before deployment, the tension in the barracks was suffocating. One of the most aggressive soldiers in the platoon looked Desmond in the eyes with pure hatred and made a macabre promise. He said that when they entered real combat, Desmond would not come back alive because one of his own comrades would shoot him in the back. The stage was set. The cruel theory of training was about to be left behind. The real war, the true and uncontrollable carnage, was just beginning, and the boy who swore never to kill was about to look the devil straight in the eyes.
The year was 1944. The ocean voyage carried the infantry division to the damp, putrid, and unforgiving reality of the Pacific theater. Forget the open-field battles of Europe. The war in the Pacific was fought in dense jungles that felt alive, under suffocating heat, against a fanatical enemy who considered surrender the ultimate dishonor. The first major test of Desmond Doss's faith took place on the island of Guam and soon after in the bloody battles for the Philippines. Desmond's battalion pushed through the mud, expecting contact with the enemy, and when the first real firefight erupted, it was an absolute reality shock for all the American soldiers. The entire jungle seemed to explode. Deadly booby traps went off. Perfectly camouflaged Japanese machine gun nests opened a simultaneous crossfire, cutting trees and men in half. When the first American soldier fell to the ground, screaming in agony, his body riddled with bullets, the most basic human instinct took over the troops. The same brave men who had sworn to shoot Desmond in the back at training camp froze. They threw themselves into the mud, paralyzed by overwhelming fear. Instinct tells you to cower and hide when lead is flying at 1,000 miles an hour in your direction. But Desmond did not hesitate for a single second. Without carrying a weapon to protect himself, without asking for covering fire, he stood up partially and ran across the open, muddy terrain, with tracer bullets buzzing and cutting the air mere inches from his helmet. He threw himself next to the wounded soldier, opened his medical kit with steady hands, stopped the arterial bleeding under intense fire, hoisted the 200-pound man onto his back, and dragged him dozens of yards to the safety of a trench. The other soldiers watched this scene in absolute shock. They couldn't believe what their own eyes were seeing. The next day, under another fierce attack, he did the exact same thing, and the next day too. Gradually, the perception of the entire battalion began to drastically change. The man from Virginia they used to spit on and call a coward was voluntarily going to places no armed man had the courage to go. Even more impressively, during patrols, Desmond would find severely wounded Japanese soldiers left behind to die. While other Americans wanted to execute them, Desmond knelt beside the enemies, cleaned their wounds, injected morphine to ease their pain, and offered water from his own canteen. To Desmond, the moment a man fell wounded, he ceased to be an enemy wearing an opposing uniform and became just a human being in agony who needed compassion. During weeks of non-stop combat in the Philippines, the brutality only escalated, and the unarmed medic's dedication reached feverish levels. He went 3, sometimes 4 days without sleeping a single minute. Covered in blood from head to toe, dehydrated and exhausted, he jumped from foxhole to foxhole, whispering psalms and prayers while applying tourniquets and blood plasma. The hostility and hatred of the platoon melted away, transforming into a silent, deep, and reverent respect. Those young men realized the hard way that the man without a gun was in fact the only real guarantee they had of making it back alive to their mothers and wives. And pay close attention to this. Desmond didn't have to fire a single rifle shot. He didn't have to destroy or kill to prove his worth to those men. He used his unshakable courage, his extreme compassion, and his absolute loyalty to his own principles. And just as Desmond stood firm in what he believed, even when the whole world told him to fall back, we on this channel stand firm in our mission to bring the most extraordinary, intense, and forgotten stories of the world to you. If the absurd story of this man's bravery and loyalty is making your heart beat faster, I ask you to pause for just 1 second, hit the like button down below, and subscribe to the channel right now.
Your support is the vital fuel that keeps our front line pushing forward to research, write, and produce these epic scripts that are impossible to stop watching. Have you subscribed and left a like? Then take a deep breath and prepare your mind, because the Philippines were just a warm-up. We are now going to march into the darkest, most terrifying, and lethal place on the face of the earth. We reach the spring of 1945. The Allied war machine turns its eyes to a small island in the Pacific called Okinawa. It was the last great barrier, the final bastion of defense before the dreaded invasion of the Japanese mainland itself. The Japanese command knew that if Okinawa fell, the empire was finished. Therefore, the order was not to win, but to cause the maximum amount of pain, bloodshed, and death possible to break the American spirit. The most crucial strategic point of the entire island was a vertical geographical nightmare, officially known as the Maeda Escarpment, soon dubbed by American soldiers as Hacksaw Ridge. Imagine a massive vertical rock wall, a nearly smooth cliff face of coral and stone, about 400 feet high, the equivalent of scaling a 40-story building out in the open. The top was not a peak, but a vast, flat plateau. What American intelligence did not know is that this plateau was infested with the most formidable network of subterranean tunnels, concrete pillboxes, artillery bunkers, and machine gun nests the Imperial Japanese Army had ever built. They were inside, in the dark, just waiting. To climb this natural fortress, American troops tied enormous heavy ship cargo nets to the edges of the rocks. The men of Desmond's battalion began the long, funereal climb. As they ascended those nets foot by foot, the silence at the top was terrifying. Where was the enemy? Why weren't they firing? When they arrived exhausted at the top of the mountain, the landscape that greeted them looked like the surface of the moon. It was a desolate terrain, riddled with massive bomb craters, charred trees, ashes scattered across the ground, and a thick fog of smoke and dust that severely limited visibility. The battalion advanced slowly, dozens of yards into the plateau. Everything seemed strangely calm. And then, in a fraction of a second, the earth beneath them literally opened up. The Japanese counterattack was not a battle. It was an overwhelming tidal wave of steel, fire, and absolute fury. From hundreds of hidden spider holes in the ground, enemy soldiers emerged by the thousands, as if sprouting from the earth itself, screaming and firing. Heavy machine guns spit a crossfire so dense it tore through the fog and cut soldiers in half before they could even raise their rifles. Grenades and mortars rained from the dark sky like fiery hail. In a matter of minutes, the American defense line was completely decimated. Bodies fell, torn apart on the barren earth, their blood staining the dust red. The force of the impact and the numerical superiority of the surprise attack were so devastating that the officers, realizing the entire battalion would be wiped out in minutes, screamed the final, desperate, and inevitable order: retreat! Everyone to the nets! Get down the cliff now! Abandon the position! And that is exactly what they did. Discipline turned into a primal survival instinct. The survivors ran blindly and threw themselves down the cargo nets, sliding and falling in total panic, retreating to the safe base of the mountain. But in doing so, they left behind dozens upon dozens of dead and wounded Americans, groaning in pain, scattered in the mud at the top of the cliff, completely unable to walk, just waiting to be cruelly executed by Japanese patrols that were already beginning to scour the battlefield with bayonets drawn. Down below, in the safety of the cliff's base, the officers looked up at the thick black smoke covering the top. They had lost the mountain and lost half their men. But high above, amidst the smell of gunpowder, burning flesh, and the agonizing screams of the wounded, there was one single figure standing. Desmond Doss watched his commanders and comrades retreat down the ropes. He looked around and saw the ground covered with dozens of Americans bleeding in the mud. He didn't have a weapon. Death was walking rapidly towards him in the form of thousands of enemy soldiers. He should have gone down. Any rational human being with a love for their own life would have climbed down immediately, but Desmond did not look down. He looked up at the black, smoky sky, fell to his knees, and made a request that would defy the laws of nature. Kneeling in the blood and mud atop the hell of Hacksaw Ridge, surrounded by a Japanese army relentlessly advancing and finishing off wounded Americans with bayonet thrusts, Desmond closed his eyes. The roar of explosions shook the earth beneath his knees. He clasped his dirty hands together and whispered just one sentence, a desperate prayer that would echo forever in human history. "Lord, please help me get one more." He opened his eyes, took a deep breath, and instead of running to the edge of the cliff to escape, he sprinted straight into the heart of the darkness and the crossfire. Meanwhile, naval artillery from massive American ships out in the ocean began furiously bombarding the top of the cliff with gigantic shells to try and stall the Japanese advance. This meant that lethal American bombs were raining down on Desmond's own head. Crawling like a ghost among the smoking craters, the air thick with tear gas and smoke, he searched for signs of life. He found the first soldier leaning against a destroyed stump, his legs completely mangled. With a physical strength that bordered on the supernatural for a skinny man who didn't eat meat, Desmond applied tourniquets, hoisted the 200-pound soldier onto his shoulders, and dragged him through the mud for dozens of yards to the edge of the 400-foot vertical cliff. But there was a seemingly unsolvable problem. How was he going to lower a severely wounded man, completely unable to hold on, down a 40-story stone wall without him plummeting to his death? It was then that Desmond's brilliant mind remembered an ironic detail. Remember the military training in South Carolina, where officers mocked him, punished him, and made him tie knots in ropes for hours on end while the others practiced shooting? That was where he learned and perfected a special double bowline knot. Working frantically at the edge of the abyss under enemy fire, Desmond quickly grabbed a thick rope and tied this double loop, passing it around the wounded soldier's chest and legs, creating a secure improvised harness. Then, Desmond anchored the rope around a sturdy tree stump rooted in the ground, wrapped the rope around his own body to create friction, and, using the full weight of his own skinny frame as a counterweight anchored in the mud, he began to lower the dangling soldier into the void, slowly, foot by foot, sliding the rope through his bare hands until the wounded man safely touched the ground 400 feet below. Down at the base of the mountain, the retreating Americans looked up at the sky in sheer disbelief. Out of the thick fog and the roar of artillery, a severely wounded American soldier was descending, dangling from a rope, straight into the shocked arms of the rear medics. As soon as the rope went slack, Desmond pulled it back up. He didn't stop to rest for a single second. He crawled right back into the darkness of the battlefield. Bodies littered the ground, gunfire erupting left and right. He found another man blinded by blood on his face. He calmed him down, dragged him to the edge, tied the double bowline, braced his feet, and lowered him down the rope. Night fell heavily over Okinawa, and the darkness brought an even greater, more claustrophobic level of terror. Japanese patrols were now walking slowly across the blood-soaked battlefield with flashlights and bayonets, methodically checking every hole for survivors. Desmond came within millimeters of being discovered dozens of times. On one occasion, he had to cover a wounded American soldier with dirt, lie down next to him, and play dead, holding his breath while enemy soldiers walked so close that the dirt from their footsteps fell onto Desmond's face. As soon as the patrol passed, he went back to work. He sneaked silently through the trenches, injecting morphine in total darkness, guided only by the muffled sounds of moaning. He made the lethal trek from the front lines to the edge of the cliff countless times, pulling heavy men, one at a time. Desmond's hands began to develop massive, deep blisters. The flesh on his palms was torn down to the raw meat due to the brutal, non-stop friction of the hemp rope sliding with the weight of dangling human bodies. His legs shook uncontrollably. His back muscles felt like they were tearing with every movement. His physical and mental exhaustion reaching a point where the human body normally shuts down. But with every man he lowered down the slope, he looked at the dark sky and repeated his delirious, exhausted mantra. "Lord, give me strength for just one more. Just one more. Let me get just one more." One by one, 10 men, 20, 50 men rescued from certain death. He continued this solitary Herculean effort for an unbelievable 12 uninterrupted hours of pure nightmare. When day finally broke and the zone became too bright, making it impossible to move without being instantly shot, Desmond finally climbed down the cargo net. The palms of his hands were worn to the bone, bleeding in shreds and trembling. In that single, endless night, the army estimated there were 100 men left behind. Desmond modestly claimed he could only have saved about 50. To reach an official compromise, the United States Army recorded that Desmond Doss officially, and without a shadow of a doubt, saved the lives of 75 men, alone, without firing a single shot. In the days that followed, the battle for Okinawa raged on, and the Iron Medic, with his hands bandaged, refused to go to the rear. He kept pushing forward with the front line, until, weeks later, during a night attack, a Japanese grenade landed directly inside the cratered trench where he and 3 of his men had taken cover. To save his friends, Desmond stomped and kicked the grenade hard, but it exploded in the air, mere inches away. Hundreds of sharp, red-hot metal shrapnel pierced his legs and hip. He fell to the ground, bleeding profusely, with catastrophic injuries. He spent 5 hours tending his own wounds in the mud before the stretcher-bearers could reach him. They placed him on a stretcher to carry him out of the kill zone, but as they carried him, Desmond, even in near-fatal agony, saw another American soldier lying on the ground with a head wound. What did the conscientious objector do in that moment? He violently rolled himself off his own stretcher and furiously demanded that the medics take the other man, who was in worse condition, in his place. While waiting for a second rescue team, lying in the open dirt and crawling, a hidden Japanese sniper spotted his movement. The heavy-caliber shot echoed across the mountain and struck Desmond's left arm, shattering the bone. Bleeding near to death, unable to walk, and with his arm dangling in pieces, Desmond Doss did something of brutal, poetic irony. He crawled over to the body of a fallen soldier and picked up an abandoned rifle from the ground. It was the first, only, and last in the entire Second World War that Desmond Doss ever touched a firearm in combat. He didn't point it at the enemy. He didn't pull the trigger. He used the steel barrel of the killing weapon to create an improvised splint, tied it to his own shattered arm using his teeth and his good arm, and crawled in agony for over 300 yards across the soaked ground under intense enemy fire until he reached the medical aid station and passed out. When Desmond finally woke up and was safe aboard a Navy hospital ship, he realized something devastating. Reaching for the breast pocket of his blood-stained uniform, he noticed that the small pocket Bible his wife Dorothy had given him, which he read every single day, had fallen somewhere on the battlefield in Okinawa. Heartbroken, he reported the loss. When this news reached the ears of his battalion back on the island, one of the most extraordinary military orders in history was given. The very same men who had once spit on him, who called him useless, who wanted to beat him and throw him out of the army, the men whose lives he had saved by pulling them from the edge of the abyss, received an order to sweep the island under fire. And amidst the unexploded bombs, decaying bodies, and burning ruins of Okinawa, those hardened American soldiers meticulously scoured the torn earth, stone by stone. They searched until they found the small sacred book, stained with dirt and blood, carefully dried it out, and mailed it back home to return it to their guardian angel. In October 1945, on the green lawn of the White House, President Harry Truman, standing before dozens of high-ranking military officers, shook Desmond Doss's ruined hand. With profound respect, the president placed the Congressional Medal of Honor around his neck, the highest, most prestigious, and rarest military decoration of the United States of America. As he placed the medal around the neck of the man who refused to kill, the president looked him in the eyes and said loud and clear, "I consider placing this medal around your neck a much greater honor than being the president of this country." The story of Desmond Doss is not just an anecdote or an isolated account of the horrors of World War II. It is the historical, definitive, and undeniable proof that the greatest power that exists in the universe is not forged in the heavy lead of bullets, the impenetrable steel of tanks, or the deafening fury of artillery. Humanity's greatest power resides purely in the mind and the spirit. A mind truly shielded by an unbreakable conviction and a heart anchored in love for one's fellow man has the terrifying ability to defy mathematical probability, tear the statistics of death in half, and alter the very fabric of the reality we live in. On a world stage built and funded purely for the massive annihilation of human life, the greatest and most overwhelming victory history has ever witnessed was won by a skinny man from Virginia who refused to hate. He reached his bare, unarmed hand into the center of the heart of darkness, and instead of bringing death, he pulled life back into the light. And if you think the human body and mind cannot push past even more bizarre, dark, and terrifying limits during the indescribable chaos of war, you definitely haven't seen anything yet. On your screen right now is our full, detailed video about the Ghost Army of World War II. This is a story of military illusion and genius so incredibly disturbing and classified that governments of world powers tried to hide its files from the public for decades on end. Click on that video right